Good evening. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 4th Annual Worldwide Alumni Leaders Assembly, sponsored by the Columbia Alumni Association. As the chair of the conference, I want to express my deepest thanks to the dedicated Planning Committee, Joe Ehrlich, Andrew Fellingham, Christoph Knox, Dan Libby, Ellen Peligian, and Eric Ree, who have worked throughout the summer in planning this special program. I would also like to thank Susan Fagan, Senior Vice President of Development and Alumni Relations, a dedicated alumna herself, for her full-fledged support of this assembly. And I really want to thank the outstanding staff of the Alumni Relations Office, especially Jose Gonzalez, Eileen English, and Jesse Mygot, who've worked tirelessly in making all of our planning become a reality this weekend. And I especially want to thank President Lee Bollinger, our moderator this weekend, who has been a great champion of alumni involvement in our university. It has been under his leadership that the Columbia Alumni Association was established, and it is under his stewardship that alumni programs at Columbia are thriving, receiving the recognition and support necessary for ongoing growth and development. We are deeply appreciative, President Bollinger. Thank you. I would like to say a special thank you to our esteemed panelists, John Carigliano, Peter Farrelly, Merritt Janow, Louis Frankfurt, and Kai Fu Lee, all of whom are proud alumni of our great university and individuals who are making a difference at the highest levels of business and arts throughout the world. They have taken the time from their very busy schedules to be with us this evening to share their perspective on globalization in business and the arts, the role of Columbia in our ever-changing world. On behalf of the Columbia Alumni Association and all our alumni gathered here in the hall tonight, thank you for your participation. I know that this is going to be a very thoughtful and thought-provoking conversation. And I want to thank you, our alumni community, for joining us tonight. And I want to thank you for all that you do to help make Columbia University the greatest university that it is. I would now like to call upon the chairman of the Columbia Alumni Association, Jim Harden, who put his trust in our committee and gave us the freedom and encouragement to experiment with a new format for the assembly this year. Jim, thank you very much. Enjoy the evening.
Well, thank you all for coming, and I hope that in addition to enjoying and benefiting from this evening's program, that some of you will consider attending tomorrow morning's assembly of the alumni leadership, wherein we have another series of presentations and panels by some of our distinguished alums. This information, if it's not available at your places, is certainly available on the web. We have, in addition to the pleasure and the privilege of the president of the university being with us this evening, tomorrow morning we will hear from the chair of the university trustees, Bill Campbell. We will hear at the medalist gala dinner in Low Library from the vice chair of the trustees and the chair of the university trustees alumni and development committee, Richard Whitten, and the keynote will be delivered by Jeff Sachs. So we really have a wonderful weekend planned. I'm indebted very much to Donna's leadership. As the chair, of course, the trick is to just pick the right people and then get out of the way, and it certainly worked this time. I share this evening with the rest of the board of the Columbia Alumni Association, and I encourage those of you who are alums, who are interested in becoming involved with Columbia, becoming involved with one another as alums, to investigate the CAA, and if you're interested, get in touch. We'd be happy to begin to recruit the next generation of leadership for this alumni initiative. Without any further remarks, I would like to introduce and ask to come to the podium so he can present in some more detail this evening's panel, the university president who has been both a staunch supporter of the CAA, but also a wonderful and effective strategic leader at Columbia on all topics global, Lee Bollinger.
I think that's station. Thanks very much, Jim. I'll just speak from here so we can get started. I want to begin by thanking all of the leaders who are here from the Columbia Alumni Association and also each of the schools representing the alumni associations and the various affinity groups. There are several trustees here, Armin Arvanesian, Mike Rothfeld, and George Van Amsen. We're always glad to have trustees. Jim Harden has taken on the task of helping to create the CAA. As you know, this is much needed at Columbia. That is a unified sense of alumni loyalty to the institution, as well as to our individual schools and the college and so on. To pull this off requires the work of a lot of people over a long period of time. Steve Case was a very, very fine leader who began the process, and Jim has taken over, and it's just a really, really important thing, and he's been great at this. And Donna Rosenthal, it takes a willingness to see other possibilities, a kind of openness to new kinds of organization, new kinds of structure, and you were there right from the beginning with that kind of might I even say, academic openness that we so prize in the academic community, and you helped us to bring it to where we are today. So there are many people who have helped to make this possible. I want to thank them all, but let's get right down to the work. So we have a great group of alumni with us today. We have the composer John Corigliano, 59, CC, filmmaker and School of the Arts. Graduate Peter Farrelly, great filmmaker. Lou Frankfurt, 1969, alumnus of our business school, who is chairman and CEO of Coach. Fellow law school graduate Merritt Jano. We both commented on the way in. Merritt said, every time I walk into this room, I get anxious because there is in the sort of, unerasable imagination, the risk of being called on. I often say that I became a law professor so that I could call on people just like I had been, a sort of tit for tat. So Merritt is a member of the WTO appellate body and director of the International Economic Policy Concentration at Columbia's School of International Public Affairs and on the law school faculty. Kai-Fu Lee graduated from Columbia College in 1983 and is now vice president of Google and president of Google in Greater China. You just can't put together a better group of people to think about globalization, business, the arts, how it all links up, and so here we are. It does seem, I'd sort of like to go back 5 to 10 years ago and sort of just ask each of you to talk a little bit about how globalization occurred to you. I remember 6, 7 years ago coming here and feeling just intensely that I was woefully ignorant about the world, and it just seemed impossible to be the leader of a great university in New York City and know as little as I knew, in all candor, about the world. How much did I really know about China? And how much did I really know about India and emerging countries and Africa and South America and so on? And I think we've all been in the process of educating ourselves over the past decade. And a little bit of that personal history would be interesting, but I'm not going to start there. I hope that you'll weave it into your comments. Where I'm going to start is where we are today, right at this moment, and that is in the midst of a great world financial crisis, and at times on the brink of the precipice. So it seems to me that we can't start any place else than there. And I think we've got Kai-Fu and Merritt and Lou, who it'd be wonderful to hear some just opening comments, very brief, because we want to keep this conversationally going. Just how do you see the current economic crisis? How do you see us going from here? Kai-Fu, do you want to start?
Sure. I think clearly the economic crisis affects the whole world. We do see that in some countries, such as China, where I live, there are some pockets of insulation. And in the internet industry where I work, I think it's not felt as strongly as other industries, as we're pleased to have announced earnings that we thought were okay, but the street seems to have thought they were great. I guess everything is in relative terms. I think in terms of the past 5 or 10 years, the greatest, most amazing thing was really the internet. I think not only has that connected the whole world up, but it's much more than sharing information. It's about bringing people together. It's about giving people access to information that may have previously been forbidden. It's about accessing long-tail, infrequent information. It's about giving choice to the people. And it's about advancing the state of education in countries like China, India, Vietnam, and others. So I think the internet has been the greatest factor that's broke down barriers and connected the world together. And that's why I decided to join this industry. And I'm pleased to play a part in helping globalization through the use of internet.
And how do you think China will be affected by this global crisis? I mean, there's a general view that goes like this. China has built up an amazing economy primarily around exports. And now with consumer demand in the United States going down and the untenability of the system, the current account deficit and so on, that China is going to see and feel, and is already feeling, a very significant downturn in revenues from the export side.
Yeah.
And yet, the only way to compensate is to go to a domestic consumption, and in China, the savings rate is so high because there's so few social security kind of networks that you haven't built up yet that power of domestic consumption. So,
Right.
So how do we get from here to there, and what will happen in between? And everybody's always concerned about instability in China.
Yeah.
I mean, might as well go into the big subjects right away, and then I'm going to turn to Merritt and ask her perspectives on this business. What do you see here?
Okay. Well, actually, I think China's domestic market has grown a lot faster than people might otherwise perceive. I think China's export business only accounts for about a third of the gross domestic product. So I think certainly that export business is being hurt dramatically. I've talked to some people who are in the export business in China, and their business is down 40%. And that's a dramatic impact. But the other 2/3 of the domestic market appears to be well. And I think certainly consumer confidence is still very good. Mm-hmm. The government obviously gives a very strong message that everything's okay, China's insulated, which I think is too positive. Mm-hmm. On the other hand,
But you've got $2 to $3 trillion of money to help get through this.
And right. I think, and then they will step in when needed.
Right.
I don't think any bank will go out of business. The government will do what it takes. So the strong, if authoritarian, if you will, government, I think at this moment of crisis, can play a strong, reassuring role, so that I think China will emerge okay, despite some businesses, especially export ones, will definitely take a big hit.
Thanks, Kai-Fu. Merritt, your field is international trade, and of course, sitting on the WTO, you have this, and having worked in the U.S. government in various roles, in this, you have this wonderful perspective on sort of how we got to this point. Love to hear about that, but also, can the system of international trade remain the way it has been up to now, or is it going to undergo really revolutionary changes as a result of this?
Well, I think this period is really pointing up the attributes of globalization and some of the dark side. There's no doubt about that. And as little as 4 months ago, I was in Asia and talking to many who were arguing that we had reached an era of decoupling. I'm sure Kai-Fu has heard this, where growth in Asia could and would continue almost irrespective of what happens in the United States or the Eurozone. And to my mind, this is clearly wishful thinking.
So you think that theory of decoupling was
I think it was very much overblown.
an illusion, yeah.
Yeah, it's just overblown. I mean, certainly growth in Asia, my sense is going to help us a lot as we are in, or surely will soon be recognized to be in a recession. So it will help us get out of there, but I don't think this idea of decoupling has proven itself to be durable. You've seen U.S. markets go down by about 33%. I think you see Chinese going down, and Russia down about 60%. And so, I mean, to my way of thinking, globalization is mostly positive and is unavoidable. The only way it would stop would be because of some major calamitous events.
Yeah.
But government policies will certainly affect the pace of it. International trade and finance are different in their impacts, and liberalization is different. And during the Asia crisis, we had a very vigorous debate here at Columbia among our faculty on those differences. And I think they are right. I do think that this period generally should be obliging us to think again about what is needed at the national level and at the international level to deal with economic globalization, and whether and how we should be improving our institutions. I think the WTO is at risk for becoming increasingly obscure, but I think that it's an important institution that has injected a degree of security and predictability
Could I
into the
ask you
system.
on that merit, because that's really a powerful statement, that the WTO is at risk of becoming obscure. Is that because bilateral trade agreements are now becoming the norm, and rather than international trade? What is behind that statement?
Well, I think, first of all, 95% of global trade is covered by the rules of the WTO.
Yeah.
And so, that's enormously important. There are important areas that we're facing now that are outside of the rule architecture, things like antitrust, things like banking and securities, and so forth. That's really a national matter. But you are seeing more bilateral and regional free trade agreements. And you're seeing, a tremendous inability of the multilateral system to reach new accords. The part of the system that is working well is the dispute settlement system, and that is, I think, a very important function, because instead of the old confrontational approach of the 70s and 80s, where big powers could get concessions from small, everything is rule-based and through an impartial tribunal. So to me, that's a real plus. But countries have not been willing to come forward to each other's satisfaction. I think the next administration could, if they chose to make it a priority, could reach a deal. And I think that's enormously important. Martin Wolf had an essay in the FT the other day saying globalization was at risk. And I don't think that's inherently at risk, but policies could put it at risk. And, if protectionism were to increase here or elsewhere, that might be so.
And when people say now, there's a common theme again, that the world has become more integrated as a result of internet significantly, as a result of markets. I mean, the change in China towards markets and openness of other major societies. I mean, that's a stunning change in the last 10, 15 years. Ease of travel, common languages that people now speak, all of these things have created a much more interconnected world, and that's what we constantly refer to by the label of globalization. However, the point is made, our institutions have not in any way caught up with that reality. So we could, in the 20th century, create all kinds of government agencies to deal with interstate commerce and labor standards and this and that, because we had a country we could turn to change politically. But it's much harder on the global scale. So how, over the next 5, 10 years, because people are now saying this global financial crisis does not have the institutions that are capable of dealing with it. Coordination, cooperation is great, but it's not enough. You sit on these international bodies. What can be created? What should be created institutionally?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a full-blown answer. I do think that that a multilateral institution was created out of a recognition that national responses were insufficient.
Yeah.
And so, there's a lot of talk in this country and around the world about loss of sovereignty associated with these international institutions. To my way of thinking, it was an exercise of sovereignty to establish them. And the WTO is imperfect as it is, needs to be bolstered. I don't think you're going to see I don't see the enthusiasm for a global financial regulatory body. Mm-hmm. But I do think that there is scope for improved coordination, new emergency powers. There will be, coming out of this period, clearly, a lot of regulation. Mm-hmm. And so the challenge is going to be to think through mechanisms that better think through the linkage between domestic and international.
Thanks, Merritt. Lou, you're on the ground. You've got stores all over the place. You're in the vanguard of this. How do you see it? How's it affecting you? How are you going to back away from globalization?
First, I do share the view that the internet has created, has helped create a much more global-oriented consumer, and we have been the beneficiary. Whether it's and it's not only the internet, of course. It's literature, it's cinema, it's world events. What we're finding is are many common threads among consumers. Our consumers, who are our target consumers, are female, college-educated, primarily came of age during the internet era, and are focused on innovation, on self-improvement, relevance, and value. And we actually believe that our consumers in New York or Chicago in many ways have more in common with our consumers in Beijing and Tokyo than they do with consumers who primarily shop in Walmart in North America. In terms of the literature they read, the movies they see, the way they spend their free time, their aspirations, their values. So for us, we're a beneficiary of the speed up of globalization. With regard to the economic crisis, which of course we as retailers saw it early, and you see it if you look at traffic day on day, and you look at conversion of traffic, and we started to see a slowdown in mall traffic in the United States about a year ago. And we said in January publicly that we felt there was a consumer malaise, a consumer recession. Mm-hmm. And it obviously has been intensified by so many different factors. I believe that consumers are not going to go back to the level of spending that where they were just a few years ago for a generation. I think the delevering that's occurring.
Because they were over,
They were over-levered.
11 credit cards per person on
It's
average.
whether it's 11 credit cards or a sense that of immunity against poverty, whether it was a perception that housing prices were going to continue to grow, that their wealth in the stock and the equity markets was going to continue, and with the enormous reduction in value in global markets, everyone is affected and everyone is taking a deep breath. So at Coach, we recognize that we need to be actually more innovative during this period so that we can capture consumers' emotional appeal. That is, we can appeal to consumers emotionally when they're otherwise reluctant to spend. Mm-hmm. So what we have done is on the product side, because we're a product-driven company, and I mentioned this to you before briefly, we've compressed several years of product innovation into 1 year. And what that looks like from our point of view is that if you go into a Coach store anywhere in the world in December of 2008 and you last visited in 2007, you're going to be wowed by the level of differentiation of the product, and hopefully will be more compelled to purchase than you otherwise would. It would be as if you're going into a store in 2010. Mm-hmm.
How many people in the audience have ever bought something from Coach?
Okay.
You got a big fan club here.
Please visit us during this holiday. Great value, high service.
Well, I think we're done. Thanks very much, Lou. So, John and Peter, let's go to the arts. And just so many dimensions of this that we could talk about, and one of the things I want to get to is the extent to which you have more and more created with a kind of global audience in mind compared to some period of time ago in which maybe one had a different audience. Also would love to know about issues of censorship, but we'll get to that. Let's start with how has your own work been affected by what we're calling the phenomenon of globalization. John?
Well, personally, I had a very good experience with it because the internet and globalization has made it possible for people to hear my music in countries that I never visited. I do go a lot of places. 5 or 6 years ago when I was in Beijing, I lectured at the conservatory, and a young woman raised her hand and said, I'm doing my doctoral thesis on your Second Symphony. At first I was amazed at that, just for the sake of doing it. But the second thing was that it was not yet published, nor was there a commercial recording of it, but she had the music and a recording of it. And so you have to see how important that is. I mean, she managed not only to get interested in something by an American composer that was so distant from her world, but she actually was able to find through the internet all the information she needed to do her thesis. And I've been in touch with young composers from Siberia, from all parts of China, from South America. So I think there's a huge, huge difference. But I think that, interestingly, the economics of our art are changing enormously.
Yeah.
Classical music, when we go back, has always been an art of patronage. The church, or rich people, or the state. Putting on an opera is a very expensive event. And what has happened over the years into the 20th century is that foundations, corporations have all been part of the donors to, say, the Metropolitan Opera House, rich people, etc. After 9/11, there was a tremendous drop of donors for all sorts of reasons, and of audiences. And I think that we've all realized that the large-scale version of our art has to change. We will always have the Met, but many opera houses are reducing, as is Broadway. If you go to a Broadway musical now, you don't have an orchestra of 40 people in the pit. You have 6 people in the pit if you're lucky, or 4, because that's the way the economics are working now, and a cast of 7. It's a very different world we're living in. And one of the interesting things is that this gives advantage to new kinds of art forms, because we are directing it into smaller ensembles of performance. We now have young composers who are not able to get performed by major symphonies, writing pieces for these smaller ensembles, getting them published because they have various publication things like Sibelius and Finale, where they can make their music printed, making their own CDs, which in the old days of the LP, it was impossible for you to make your own LPs, but now a 22-year-old can be on the web, have a website, a MySpace, a blog, sell his recordings, rent his music all over the world. And so the direction has gone this way rather than that way, but it's been a very inventive time for young artists. And in fact, I would say that there are so many young composers now that when we always talk about classical music as a dying field, not if you count the number of young composers, there's hundreds more than when I was a young composer. So it's actually a very interesting time.
Well, that's fascinating, of course. But is there a loss in not having the big production sort of thing? And my particular interest right now has been for a long time is the press. And my belief is we built up a magnificent system of the press in the 20th century in this country. And now the internet makes it possible for the press to reach thousands of times more audience members than, or subscribers or viewers or readers than before, but it's undermining the business model of the traditional media that we created.
I have to say, I think it's a good thing.
So that's worth debating.
Let me explain why.
Yeah.
It's true that many newspapers. I just was down in Miami for performance, and the Miami Herald does not have a music critic anymore, and people are getting signed architecture and music or various combinations like that. And it is true that the major papers are suffering. But if you have any event like that event in Miami or the opening of the new John Adams opera, and you just click on that, you will find more reviews of that than you can imagine. And they will be by critics from all the papers of the United States that you can read and Europe. And then blogs by interested musicians and music lovers. I think it's much healthier atmosphere because we have a very wide range of criticism now.
And I guess the question would be, putting it in your own field, whether that very healthy kind of public forum that now exists that is just amazing. I mean, it's the equivalent of the New England town meeting, the classic kind of model in which everybody can come and participate. But is it a loss that the kind of major productions are now...
Happen. They
still happen.
They still happen. It's not that. There are endowments, orchestra have endowments, and the Met is streamlining itself a bit, but it's going to do what it does. But I would say that the interest of the musical community is turning away from that as the sole goal.
Right.
It's widening itself enormously to include smaller ensembles, smaller groups, as well as these big groups that will be there. But I think it's really wonderful to see how many more opportunities there are, thanks to technology.
That's got to be a good, absolutely. Peter, how do you see it?
Well, first of all, let me say I'm glad I'm speaking last because I know less than anybody on this panel, I can assure you. Saying that right up front.
So we'll be the judge of that.
Global economy, I never heard of it until you called me 2 weeks ago. Global what? No. Also, I did want to say one thing about this crisis we're going through, the economic crisis. Like, I'm looking at this like, it feels to me exactly as it would feel if aliens made contact. They came down and said, we're here, we do exist, and we're all like, okay, now what? That's how I feel like. I have no clue how this is going to affect my business, your business, anyone's business.
Right.
It's sort of, we're just staring there like, okay, and what's the next move? You know, we don't know what's going to happen. But what I do know is it does point out when aliens come down that we are one people, this world. You know, we're all in this thing together. It's really interesting how this has happened. It's not like just the U.S. is getting crushed,
Right.
and everyone else is like, woo, you know, we're doing well. There is like, you know, we have aliens on all planets right now. We are just looking, and it's completely unknown. So I really don't know what's going to happen. But I will say this. Traditionally, my business has been the greatest business really to be in America. It's a huge export, the film business. Always has been for 50, 60 years. Every country. They wanted our movies.
Right.
They didn't want our cars. You go to Europe, there's different kinds of cars, you know. There's different everything, but they had our movies. They loved our movies. And one reason was, you know, people liked all things American, but one reason was they didn't have a lot of money to make a lot of other movies. You know, they didn't have money to make their own movies. And the global economy has made it possible for all these countries to suddenly say, like, hey, wait a second, you know, I'd like to tell a story about us and our people. And there are so many, you know, every country, you know, particularly India, but now Russia and China and all these countries, they are not only investing in American movies, but they're making their own movies. And in fact, 20th Century Fox just started a division for non-English speaking movies. And they're making them outside the country, and they're trying to get a piece of that world, because that is growing. That is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Whereas, you know, 10 years ago, you know, it was all American movies in all these countries, except for France, maybe, and a couple others, Germany. Now, you know, they'll have the American movies, and but they're going to have their own movies, too.
And when you create a movie, a film, do you think more in terms of a global audience now? Are you beginning to? Or are you...
You know, not really specifically. I don't think like that, honestly. But I have to say, like, you know, we're always developing 2 or 3 movies at the same time. We have just things, and for whatever reason, you can't get the actor you want, and you don't want to wait, so you go do another movie. And it's always seemed to play out in a nice way for us. And we've had this one movie that's just been sitting there forever, and we wrote it, and we just didn't get around to doing it. And we've been working on these other 2 movies, but when the economy came crashing down, it occurred to me, that's the movie we should make, and it's The Three Stooges. And the reason is because it's physical comedy, and physical comedy travels hugely.
Yeah.
Physical comedy plays in all countries. They get it, you know?
Right.
And I think the world, if you look at like all the movies in the 30s, you know, after the crash, 29, you know, those movies, it was that kind of physical. People want to forget. I want to go to the movies now. This last couple of weeks, I'm like, honey, let's go to the movies. I just want to stare and forget what's happening.
Right.
You know, forget about the aliens, you know? And so I want to make The Stooges because I do feel that it is timely right now to make a movie like that. It's sort of, for me, the way I see it, it's Dumb and Dumber and Dumb.
Yeah.
You know, I think it'll play very well right now. So I have to say, yeah, I did pick that movie now because of what's happening worldwide.
And picking up on the connection with what you do and making films and the international business, Merritt, maybe you should say something about the way in which trade currently exists with respect to culture and film and so on, just so we get that on the tape. That has lagged behind other kinds of products, right?
Yes and no. I mean, the Motion Picture Association is one of the most organized lobbies in the world, right? And so they have been forceful advocates of dissemination of American films, and it's been met with great enthusiasm in a great deal of the world. There are a few countries that regulate both for content and in a cultural sense, you know, because they want to preserve their culture and not have, you know, the spiritual pollution that comes with American culture. And But I grew up in Japan, and I grew up, watching Bonanza in Japanese. And there are many places where, American cultures and American media and films are, absolutely saturate. So I don't think, but there are exceptions. And China, of course, is one.
I was going to raise, so how many films can go into China in a year?
It's being liberalized. Years ago, when I was a trade negotiator, I met with China's chief censor. That year, there were only 2 films allowed, and that year he had allowed True Lies and Lion King. And I said, why those 2? Huh? And he said the reason was because of this excellent special effects. So maybe you can tell me if that was the commonality between those 2. But
I know they don't allow a lot now. I think it's 5.
Yeah, I think it's 5
and
too.
I think it'll be something like W would probably go over big over there.
Yeah.
That would. But they do pick it. Although, of course, walking down the street, you'll see your movies, my movies, all over the place. There's people selling them for $1 each.
Yeah.
DVDs. Seriously.
Right.
Any movie you want, you come on practically every corner. You come out,
Right.
you just flip through the things, and here's that's coming out next month in the U.S. And they already have it.
And Kaku, how about the internet and the availability of things? What do you find with respect to free availability of film and commentary and music and so on?
Well, I think certainly film and music are currently freely distributed in China, both on physical medium, CD, DVDs, as well as on the internet. And I think it's really going to be very important to figure out how to move that towards a more legal approach. Google, for example, is going through an amazingly complex deal to make legally downloadable MP3 files possible in China, basically by subsidizing this to get the habit changed, and hopefully over time, with advertising revenue, that will eventually recuperate our losses for now. But I think, but you were talking also about information and...
Well, yes, but before we get to that, I just want to pin down what you just said, which I assume to be what Merritt said and Peter said, which is that even though legally there are very severe restrictions on the number of films that can come in, and so in practice, it is readily available.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now, during the Olympics, I think there's been some crackdown, but I suspect it's temporal in nature, and it's probably loosening already.
Yeah.
I think largely for movies, people do go buy these DVDs for $1 on the street. For music, what actually happens is people go to a search engine, not Google, but someone else's, which actually supposedly crawls the internet and makes available the MP3 files, claiming no legal responsibility. Although recently it's been discovered that these other search engines actually pay for servers and bandwidth on which they put pirated copies of MP3s and make them available only through their own search engine. So I think the legal system will be quite stretched on how to, show all the forensics to prove this, and also all the. But we do hope that it starts to come into a shape, because I think it's really builds up a very bad consumer habit that they assume everything on the PC, on the internet is free, and everyone's doing it, so therefore it's not wrong. And I'm very worried about that phenomenon.
Right. So let's look ahead. From each of your standpoints, how do you think the world will look in 5 years, 10 years? I know to go beyond that, people start to think I have no idea. But in 5 to 10 years, recognizing where we've come in the last 5 years or 10 years, from your own standpoint, how does the world look differently, John?
Well, I think that it's pretty inevitable that we will end up having homes where living room walls will be screens, and sound will be all around, and they may even be several walls of screens, and we will be able to access everything through that.
And all over the world.
All over the world. And I think that's inevitable, in a sense, the way things are going. And it's terrifying in a way because the human contact is lost, even though we can see everything. We can't really interact with everything. Although I do think interactive things are starting to happen, and that will play a role in this, that more and more interactive video is going to come about. But, as I said, the living experience of going to a play or hearing a string quartet or going to a concert, where you sit with a bunch of other people and you are absorbing something that other people are doing and reacting to it and talking about it, that's, I think, psychologically going to be a very serious problem, and that is going to be very minimal.
I think that's a very powerful thing to say. Of course, a very powerful thing to say in the context of the university because we could be in that situation.
Right.
That is, we could be doing everything by that screen that is on the wall, and not having this classroom, and Merritt and I not feeling intimidated when we walk in here. It's our own living room, and so on. But yet, it seems like universities are as successful today as ever, right? I mean, the students are happy. They're paying enormous sums of money. I mean, it's very expensive to attend these universities. I always have to add that they only pay 50% of what it costs to actually give them that education. And of course, there's enormous commitment to helping people who can't afford it. So with all those qualifications, fact is, it seems to be thriving, and yet, you know, your comment and what you see is a very, very interesting sort of foretelling of the future that may have an impact on an institution like this. Peter?
Yeah, it would be horrifying to me if that happened, and it does seem to be going that way, because, you know, as anybody who's made a comedy knows, you never want to show a comedy to critics alone. You want to show it to comedies in a big room of people. We try to fill the room. We want to get 400 or 500 people in there and the critics. And because they feed off the audience. They feel like, oh, wow, you know, this is, as opposed to sit there like, wait a second, what is that in her hair? This is insane. You know, this is a nightmare. You know, what is that? This, you know, they need the audience to say, it's okay.
Right.
We're laughing at this. We're getting this. We're not appalled. Because if they're sitting there alone, it's a whole other movie. It really is.
Yeah.
I have to say, you know, you asked what it will be like in the future. Well, I was in China one time, last October, and it was, you know, how many people have been to China here? Yeah, it was completely different than I thought it would be. I went to Shanghai and Beijing, and I took my kids with me. We went to the Special Olympics World Games in Shanghai. And we went on this tower on one side of the river. It's a big space needle type thing my kids wanted to go in. And up in that space needle, you're looking across the river, and there are what appear to be 100 to 150 huge high-rises. And each of them is so futuristic. There's like a bird's nest on one of them, and there's a crown on another. And there are different lights and different shapes, and they're so superior to anything we have here, like just insanely beautiful high rises. And on the wall in this where I'm watching it from, it shows the growth. At one point that was just rice paddies right there, and it shows the first high rise going up. Now there's 3 going up. Now there's 5, 10, 15, 50, 150. That first picture, the rice paddies, that was 1994. 1994. And it tells you, like, this place is exploding. China is exploding. They have money, and they're, you know, it was, you know, the people are, you know, it was way different than I thought it would be. I thought it was going to be, you know, something, you know, that is long gone, in the cities at least. In the country, it's different. But we have to get into that market. We, you know, in my business, we can't be doing 5 movies a year and selling them on the streets.
And so what would you say to students who are at the School of the Arts right now, preparing themselves for this new world, and it's some young person who has, you know, come from a state, never been outside the country, which is, you know, sometimes the case, or if they've been outside the country, they've only been to Europe, and, you know, what do you tell them the world's going to be like?
Well, it's all about the internet, of course. The internet has brought us, the cultures are overlapping and everything's, we're starting to think more as one. I would say that, it's a huge advantage. It's going to be a big advantage to look outside the United States. It's not just U.S. anymore.
Right.
My last movie was a disaster here. Came out, did nothing. It was huge overseas. Huge. And in places that like Poland and, things that you never thought of. It was just picking up so much, worldwide that the movie made tons of money. And it really got me thinking, like, whoa, thank God for you have to be able to, you can't, I guess I would say that, you really have to think in a global way. It's like what would appeal to the world. But, of course, saying that, nobody's sitting down writing a movie or a book thinking, okay, what do they think of this in China, You write, something from your heart, and hopefully it works out.
Yeah. Merritt?
Well, I think in the next 5 to 10 years, the U.S. is still going to be the single largest economy in the world.
Yeah.
But, all these studies are showing that the relative productivity is going to shift elsewhere. So China, other parts of Asia, perhaps parts of Latin America, these big emerging markets are just going to be the engines of growth on a relative basis, not on an absolute basis. And so that really is a profound change, and we're going to have to learn how to deal with that and keep up with it and hopefully deal with the downsides of it. For the university, I've seen in the last 5 or 10 years, obviously more international students, more really global students, more collaboration with foreign universities routinely, more collaborative research, and that can only just continue. I was recently talking to a European academic president who was saying that Europe has started, they had this Erasmus program where a European can go to any university within Europe, that they've brought a Chinese university into that network.
Interesting.
And, that kind of thing I think will start to have to happen over time as other universities develop comparable skills and training.
And how does this shift of productivity to emerging economies and places around the world, how does that affect the geopolitics, do you think? I mean, Iceland makes big bets on risky investments and ends up close to bankruptcy, turns to Europe for a loan, no, turns to the United States for a loan, no. Lo and behold, Russia gives them $5 billion. Now that has to be a significant thing in the world. So how do you see this having geopolitical effects?
Well, it's very hard. I mean, I think Europe has become a much more vocal advocate for its vision of foreign policy than it was in the past. And it's part of, the European agenda, the integrated Europe as a voice in the world. So I think I do see both opportunities for collaboration, but also a lot of inherent tensions between the United States and Europe, and also the United States and China. I do think a diminished financial power is a diminished power, and the extent to which we are needing $1 billion a day of capital inflows from foreign sovereigns, it's got to have some impact.
Yeah.
So the question is, will we be able to address it by increasing our savings and reducing our borrowings? Those are big questions.
And Lou, I assume that 80% is going to shift fairly significantly, and how will this unfold from your standpoint?
When we look at the global luxury market, it's inevitable that Greater China will be the #1 market. Whether it's in 10 years or 12 years, it will be the largest. It will be the largest luxury market in the world, and that has enormous ramifications in many respects, and certainly it does for Coach. And we see ourselves as a major future player as the middle class develops in China, and by giving them products that are relevant. Actually, in our business, we do think about what, before, when we make a bag, for example, we think about what will the Chinese consumer think and what will the Japanese consumer think, and this is within the context of a global assortment. So we might tailor a particular style with a certain color or a certain exclusive bag for a particular market to deal with local differences. But the commonalities are overwhelmingly the same. I was in Bangkok a few years ago, and with my wife, and we stopped in a store, and what was a Coach store. I felt like I was in Boston, and it was exactly the same. The consumer experience, the environment.
So that's, I mean, again, that's really interesting. How does that happen? I mean, how is it because of the films? They're watching Peter's films and listening to John's music, and they're all, reading the same things and listening to the same things, watching the same things, or is there kind of a inner human yearning for a Coach bag that just is there? It's part of the DNA, and you tap into.
I would like to think that that's the case. The reality is that people who set trends in fashion, and and followers, they're looking to the fashion makers to help them understand what's relevant. And they go on the internet, and they look at magazines, and they look at movies, and they look at editorials, and they go to the lead cities within when they travel, and they go up and down the high streets, and they look at what are the people in the know wearing and carrying, and that's a very big influence. And that's part of it. And then the question comes, how do you differentiate yourself from everyone else? And you look for ways to connect we look for ways to connect with the emerging middle-class consumers by offering products that are particularly innovative and relevant at sharp price points.
So let me present a proposition and see whether you think this is true or not. American culture, in all its forms, is one of the biggest things that the United States exports. So as much as people around the world may dislike the United States' policies and practices and so on, culture continues to be something that appeals, that coming out of the United States appeals to. And Coach is part of that American identity, and you have tapped into that. Next proposition. That will change. That is, if you take Merritt's comments and other comments, as America's economic power changes, so will the appeal of its culture, and therefore you as a business are going to have to become more tapped into the other places of the world. Is there anything to that?
Well, your original hypothesis isn't valid.
It's not valid.
Okay.
A lot of people say that to me.
No, we actually position ourselves as a authentic New York brand. New York is a world city, as is Tokyo and Shanghai and London. And these cities will always be world cities. And what New York represents to people and other societies, among many things, is energy, is change, is diversity. There's a richness in New York that people really appreciate. And it's not the case in any other city, which is really the repository of people from all over the world. So we tap into New York and fashion and style. That's what we do, and we think that will be relevant. And obviously, we also don't rely on a single tenet. We have a variety of foundational elements. One is authenticity, well-made products, durability, Right. All of that stuff, like well-made belts, that last a long time. John has a belt for about 20 years from Coach. Maybe longer, I don't know. He's wearing it.
Time for a new one, don't you?
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Could I add one footnote to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I don't think that the other people's ascendancies are automatic decline.
Yeah.
You know? So it's not a zero-sum trade, it's
Yeah.
a zero-sum. And there is, of course, a blending that happens with our culture, which makes it really interesting. We have a Columbia alum who introduced Domino's Pizza to Japan, for example. And he introduced clam pizza, you know, in the shell.
Right.
I don't think this would work here, you know. But it really works well in Japan.
Yes,
so
right.
things like that.
Right. And I just want to say in my own defense, I just put this out as an idea.
We know that.
Yeah, okay.
Everyone knows that.
Kai, will you get the last word before we go to the audience? You know, so I mean, if anybody is the future here, you know, sort of the internet and Google and is the future. So what does it look like 5, 10 years?
Okay, I think the internet sort of has really stood for two really important things. One is what people call disintermediation. That's the process of getting rid of the middle agent, letting the supplier and the demand connect to each other, remove all the friction, make the whole thing more smooth and fluid. And what we have seen, of course, is in you know, buying stocks, you no longer have to pay that large a commission. Of course, maybe we're not buying stocks for a while, but and in real estate, you know, I actually sold my last house without a broker. I made it available on the internet, and
was that responsibility by being in the office of Google?
not at all.
I didn't think so.
I actually did it prior to joining Google. And a lot of other things are happening. When you buy on eBay, you're not going to some of the stores and Amazon and so on and so forth. I think that will be taken to the next level. And we talked earlier about aggregation of media. I think that's the same, right? Today, I think we are very reliant on New York Times to put together its view on what's the best combination of food critic and technology review and op-ed and commentaries and news articles. But maybe in the future, those of us who want to use the internet to its fullest extent will use Wall Street Journal for perhaps whatever your favorite is, your international trade, New York Times on politics, and USA Today on entertainment, and Yahoo Finance, and Google Blogs, and so on and so forth. And you'll subscribe to the people whose blogs you want to follow and whose views that you value, and you'll use search engine to find the things you like, and then you'll essentially make your personalized newspaper. And I think that will start to realize value.
And you think that the institutions you named can figure out a business model to survive in that kind of consumer choice? Because that's the big question.
I
mean,
think
I don't mean that's the big question. That is a big question. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think whether they like it or not,
Yeah.
it will happen because it really is Walt Mossberg that people want, not necessarily Wall Street Journal. So either the institutions figure out a model that they can keep making money, or their asset, their people, will find a way to build a business model for themselves. Now, I don't know what that model is going to be exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I suspect it's going to be advertising-based, and someone will figure it out. And I think the wonderful news is that consumers will look for more freedom, more selection, more power, and more individualized content. So that's the first projection. The second one is really more about search engines, right? Today, the search engines, people think they're wonderful, but really they're very simple. What they do is they're a tool. They find you lots of stuff, and then you have to pick out what you want. And I think over the next 5 or 10 years, they'll really become intelligent. So instead of being a tool, they'll be more like an assistant. So today, if you were buying your mother, sending flowers to her, you have to actually go through, you can go to a search engine and do a lot of things. You know, find where the flowers are, type in your credit card number, select the flower you want, type in her address. it's going to be 45 minutes before your flowers are selected and sent to her on the right date with the right card, with the right message. But really, it's not that hard. If you had a really smart assistant, your secretary or your spouse or your children or whatever, if you tell them, hey, get my mom flowers for Mother's Day, they know exactly what to do. And there's no reason a smart search engine can't do that. So a future search query might be, send mom flowers. And it'll be smart enough to figure out who is my mom, where does she live, what kind of flowers should I send, is it Mother's Day soon, is it carnation, is it roses, and then what credit card you have, how to charge it, and whether you want a discount or not, and things like that. So, of course, there are privacy issues that have to be solved as well. But I think the search engines or the internet services will have more intelligence and will help you get what you want done, not just to give you information so that you can do it yourself. So this progression from being a tool to an assistant will really give us the most valuable asset back to us, which is our time.
And just finally, Kai-Fu, I mean, I can't resist, again, listening to you and thinking about the question, what happens to us? What happens to universities? So why isn't it that a person sits there and says, okay, I think I want to take Economics 101, or, I really got to learn about international finance and WTO from Merit Jano. So I'd sign up for her course, but then I really want to take this person from Stanford, and then there's this person who doesn't, is an independent scholar and doing that, and I put together my own curriculum, and I do it over the course of my lifetime, and it's not this 4-year plus kind of life, and working during this time, and I learn as I go. Why isn't that the universe and Columbia? All of us will sort of die in this room.
The question is, who do you drink with then?
Yeah. Let me just say, I think that is the right question.
I think actually it is, because one of the benefits Google offers to our engineers in China is that they can go to, in this case, Stanford University, to take a master's in computer science, and Google will pay for it.
Yeah.
But the only requirement we have is that they do it over the internet. And in the last 3.5 years that I've managed Google China, 0 engineers signed up for this program. And I asked them why not, and they said, well, I do want to study in the top institution in the world, but I don't want to do it over the internet.
That's fantastic.
I want to be next to it.
Just what we wanted to hear.
Okay.
Good. It's open to the audience. There are microphones and any questions.
I have a question for Mr. Lee. Way over here. Way over here. Okay. I didn't realize. Usually I'll stand up, but I got to sit through this. English has been the language of the internet, more or less, in terms of international trade, but that still is a hindrance for those who can't speak or communicate in English. Is Google doing anything about making translation technology available in the future in their plans?
Yes, very much so. We've hired some of the world's top computer machine translation scientists at Google, and we crawl the world, and we use a very clever technique that lines up all bilingual text, and then we train a statistical model to do an automatic translation. And we now have about 400 language pairs on which you can do a translation. And so you go to translate.google.com, and that will provide you that service. And also, the other thing we're doing is, within search results, we're trying to include that in the index. So if you search in one language, results from other languages may appear with machine-translated results. Now, one caveat is that it's not very good. It's the best machine translation in the world, but it's not as good as any of us who are bilingual. It is a lot better than nothing. We claim it's roughly high school level of translation. And of course, we hope to continue to improve it so that in a few years we can claim it's gone to college.
Columbia American way of looking at the world, analyzing vocabulary for conflict resolution, and so forth. So if we think about the implications of this, obviously it will be easier for people to communicate with each other if they have the same vocabulary and they've discussed the same kind of issues. But down the line, how can we encourage more conflict resolution? That is, even the Europeans who knew each other so well still embarked on a world war, and First World War and the Second World, and so forth. How can we strengthen the tendencies toward peace and cooperation and collaboration instead of conflict and war?
Okay, so let me paraphrase the question, and anybody on the panel volunteer answer. There is a point that the greatest period of globalization other than what we're in right now was from the end of the 19th century until World War I. And if you go back, I'm told, and look at a lot of the talk that occurred during that period, leading up to the First World War, Second World War, it was a kind of changed world, much more integrated, much more along the lines that we're doing now. And of course, the first transatlantic cable was in, 1850 something, and you have a lot of things, the transportation of trains and ships and the like. And yet it ended up in massive world conflict and carnage. Why are we so optimistic now that 10 years from now or 20 years from now we will not have a repetition of that? And what should be done, given the sad history of the 20th century, to help avoid that outcome?
I'll make just one comment. I don't think that we can be confident that we have eliminated that possibility. I think that we have made great strides. Europe has made great strides in dealing with itself. And that, I think, has found economic integration to be an important piece of that. So that's also important. The tensions between the Arab world and the non-Arab world is a major problem, I think. But we do have these institutions, all of which need to be strengthened. So there's no good answer except, I think, to support and encourage further integration and deal with those who are disadvantaged within every society. That seems to be the only incremental approach. But I look to others for bigger visions.
A question for Merritt. If a sovereign decides to default on a WTA award, what is the enforcement mechanism?
If a country decides not to implement a ruling by the appellate body, what happens? Well, the interesting thing is that we've had about an 85+% compliance rate so far. And the actual penalty is the ability to retaliate up to the amount of trade associated with that impermissible act. So that could be smaller, it could be quite large. Some of these practices that have been found inconsistent have been up to about $15 billion. So not de minimis. But I personally don't think, so you have the ability to retaliate, but it is something that, you retaliate by raising tariffs in your own country, so you're blocking goods from the offending country. So it is a kind of game theory shooting yourself in the foot. I think compliance has happened not because they're afraid of penalties for the most part, the reputational consequences of showing yourself to be a bad actor in the world when an impartial body is applying rules that you agree upon?
Just to follow up, the reason I asked the question is because a lot of corporates go to the World Bank ICSID, and there are 34 cases. More than half the backlog is against one country, Argentina. Now you go to the 7-year process, and I think 7 have gone through the appeals process, and Argentina has chosen to default. Now the reason that Argentina has chosen to default, because once you go to the appeals court, you have to say that you will abide by the appeals court decision. And I was involved in the CMS award, and Argentina then chose to default. The reason Argentina cited that they chose to default is because in a similar situation, the US would default. So then, you see, World Bank ICSID becomes useless.
Well, I don't know the particulars of that case. I do know that, when you have so many claims against Argentina, those are investor-state claims, which is
Comes under bilateral treaty.
Government claims. And so, in a sense, sovereigns may feel differently when it comes to an investor than to another sovereign.
Well, these come under the bilateral treaty.
I think we but that is a great subject of how do you deal with trade, and especially when people don't want it.
We've heard a lot about the globalization of markets, and I'd really love to hear from some of you about, as we sit here in this great educational institution, about the globalization of the labor force, whether it's people who make music or make pocketbooks or write software. Could you comment on what you're finding in the preparedness of America's labor product, whether it's our high schools or our colleges? Are you going abroad for your labor, or are you going abroad for your labor? And if you are, is it because you need people who know those markets, or is it because they're better, cheaper, better, somehow more favorable as labor?
In music, it has been the custom, first of people, say, doing film work or trying to do recordings, because of the laws here, to go to England, and then it started being Europe and then Hungary, and it's progressing to various countries that have different laws about recording music, because our laws are quite strict, and about readings especially. So people go other places. Sometimes there's a sacrifice in quality, and sometimes there isn't. But it's really true that in certain ways, the Musicians Union has been rather stagnant about understanding that, for example, the entire classical music record sales world collapsed, and there are really no more companies that make a profit selling this. So one of the great triumphs, I think, has been at the Metropolitan Opera, because Peter Gell has managed to break through. At the Stagehands Union, there is the strongest union around, and the Musicians Union, and been able to have these telecasts all over the world. And I remember when he first got in, I said, well, geez, he wanted to do that. And I said, well, how are you going to do that, Peter? You know what happens in our country. We can't do anything. It's going to be so expensive. And he said, I'm going to have to sit down, and I'm going to have to fight that out. So I think there is a world situation in which America is certainly starting to come to grips, the orchestra in America, that they are not being cheated, for example, if they do a reading session of a young composer, and the composer is actually allowed to walk away with a recording of that piece. That he's not going to make $1 million on this, and this is not a problem. This is starting to happen now. It's very recent, and not all orchestras allow this. But I think Peter's done a great thing in breaking through the biggest, hardest one of them all, to make musicians all understand that we are all in this together, and that, in fact, we have to cooperate realistically with the
For software, let me answer. There are sort of two types of software jobs that could be moved globally. One is more the development of very simple software. The average job develops a well-specified program or testing of a program or doing a solution for a particular company. That kind of job has moved very fluidly across the globe, primarily to India, but also to Eastern Europe and China. And the kind of things I have observed in the industry is that for about a third of the cost, you can move the software development elsewhere. So what this really means is those jobs, for the time being, will be challenging in the United States. Although over time, I expect there will eventually be an equilibrium reached because those jobs are so easy to move. Now, for the type of work that Google engages in, is very high end. We do have 45 R&D centers across the world, and we are more or less the #1 employer in almost all of these 45 countries. And it's interesting to observe that about half of our labor force is still in the United States, which is a strong testament of the power of the education institutions in the U.S. and also the creativity that the graduates have in the U.S. So about 50%, and that's something to be proud of.
I was thinking about our ability to really move fluidly across the globe based upon what our requirements are. And on the manufacturing side, we have migrated primarily to lower-cost countries so that we can bring a less expensive product to market, passing on the savings and the appeal to consumers and giving ourselves a fair return. But the technical know-how we have exported with us so that we can ensure the quality would be there. Similarly, the materials we've exported. On the other hand, at retail in the 27 countries where we actually market our products, we look to develop local know-how and look to develop local staff. And only during the initial periods, formative stages, will we rely very heavily on expats. But as we become established, we look to transfer the leadership to people that are native to the country or to the region.
Which means that in terms of creativity, we're going to have to continue to be very much focused on maintaining that quality of American art. Because there's going to be more and more competition in the world. I think we have time for one more question.
With increased globalization, there's been some international discussions with the WTO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and WHO that pharmaceutical patents should be removed in order to make life-saving medicines for those in developing nations. And the rationale being that one can't live in a 21st century society without medicines. Is it possible that in about 15 years from now or so, the same view regarding this issue with patents will be put forth regarding computer software, the internet? I know the internet you can access for free, but primarily the issues of computer software, because we won't be able to compete in a global society without being a citizen of cyberspace. And I really direct the questions to both Professor Jono and to Dr. Wu.
It's a very interesting question. In the case of the patents, what we're really talking about here is mandatory licensing for addressing pandemics. So, that was one where the pharmaceutical industry and the global community could reach an accommodation. I have a hard time, I think it must be just ignorance on my part, seeing something quite analogous in the technology and software space. But it's certainly a very interesting thought, and one wonders what would that be? I mean, what would be the architecture that would need to be open that was such a fundamental utility? I'm not sure I can see that far, but I'm sure if I could clarify.
I'm not sure either, but I believe the patents for the software industry is absolutely critical to maintain in order to ensure companies that invest in it are able to get returns from their investments. However, I think separated as two different issues. So the way in which I can imagine third world countries that need access to, let's say, email, productivity tools, they can be provided for free using a number of means and still maintain the validity of the patents. As an example, Google provides basically free Google applications, which includes word processing, presentation, spreadsheet, and Gmail to universities, basically free of charge. And we can also do that, and also with the university domain names. I can see that potentially extrapolated for third world countries to bootstrap them, and I think the patents will remain valid.
So that concludes this panel. I want to say, on behalf of the university, it is just terrific to have all of you come back to talk about this. It really just enriches our sense of the world, and of course it helps to make the CAA the success we want it to be.
Any worry we might have had about having an academic-oriented presentation on a Friday evening, I think those apprehensions were quickly and easily dispelled. This was really, I think, a very engaging, enlightening, and important presentation, and also a wonderful affirmation as we begin the alumni weekend of our alumni in the world, Columbia in the world. Now, the other part of the Friday evening gathering is a little bit of relaxation and reception, and there are some guides that will direct us out of the doors in the back toward some sort of appropriate reward. Thank you very much for coming.